One long-standing hope and prediction that many have made with the Switch and now the Switch 2 as well is the emergence of a dockless alternative model. Although this may seem to cut against the hybrid nature of the system, Nintendo has some form with undercutting its core unique selling point before, as with the Switch Lite, which was fully portable, and indeed the 2DS, which literally undid the most prominent selling point of the 3DS to deliver a cheaper upgrade alternative for the DS fanbase. That said, the Switch didn't receive any such upgrade, but does that rule one out entirely? Before we consider whether one is optimal and fits with Nintendo's strategy, let's just break down what could be achieved and what benefits a dockless Switch 2 could bring. The main benefit, of course, is in terms of cost, so I'm going to start by trying to break this aspect down. We don't know exactly what the original Switch cost, but there are estimates around, and the Switch 2 may even be more difficult to pin down expenses for until after it launches at least, when we can get official teardowns. All the same, we have some guidelines. We know that at $450, Nintendo anticipated making at least a modest profit on each machine sold. Let's assume, therefore, that the retailers have a modest margin of 10%, which is probably consistent with the margins for consoles, which are typically designed to introduce people to the ecosystem, and we get a wholesale price of perhaps around $400. Remove Nintendo's own markup, let's call it 5%, and we're down to potentially about $380 as the highest end cost of production. Likely quite a bit less, as those margins don't leave an awful lot of elbow room, but if they view the Switch 2 as more like a loss leader without actually making a loss, who knows? So, how would a dockless Switch change things? That expensive new LCD display will be right out. The OLED screen seems to have been a significant cost for the Switch OLED model, to the extent where in Nintendo's recent financial report I noted that they were still using the lower margin of Switch OLED as a reason why the OLED being a larger proportion of sales did not necessarily translate to higher profits. Perhaps the screen wasn't the key differentiator, as Bloomberg analysts suggested that the OLED added only about $3 to $5 per unit, but the screen was also bigger on OLED, so who knows? At any rate, you can't really scrimp on the screen for a device that is significantly played in handheld, and with the new screen needing to compare at least respectably to the OLED model so as not to seem like a downgrade, I think this would have been relatively expensive. LCD screens typically seem to be around $20 to $30, but this is both a more advanced and a larger screen, so potentially the cost could be close to $40 or even more. There is also an extra touchscreen layer on Switch called a digitizer. Replacements are in the $15 to $25 range at retail, so if we track that back to a wholesale price, mass production prices, it's probably $5 to $10. Then there's the cost of the internal battery. If the machine was static and could be plugged in before use, the battery requirements would be far lower. iFixit charge $40 for a battery on an original Switch model, so again, removing the cost of labor, retailer markup, and such like, we're probably looking at $10, but the Switch 2 is more powerful, so let's estimate that the battery there could go for about $15. Controllers as well. If they substituted a Pro controller for the two Joy-Cons, the retail value is actually $10 less. However, I would speculate that the Pro controller probably has a higher markup than the Joy-Cons, which have more fiddly design elements and were designed to be packaged with the system. Let's assume a 10% retail markup and a 20% markup from Nintendo, and that makes the Joy-Con costs around $50 or maybe a bit more, though this could be considerably lower depending on their choice of markup. Of course, with Joy-Con, Nintendo also need the magnetic rails. Let's call this a $5 saving on the rails, although that's just a guess really. There are still issues though, as not all games would be playable without Joy-Con in the same way, but I guess in this case, Pro users would be in the market for additional accessories, which probably isn't something Nintendo will be too gutted about. Switch 2's Pro controller has reportedly been seen at Costco going for around $70, so if the wholesale price is $65, it's likely that Nintendo's production cost is at maximum around $50. But given that the retail price for the Joy-Con pair is slightly more, let's say $40 as an estimate for the Pro-Con's actual cost of manufacture to put it under the Joy-Con. It makes sense to add margins onto a luxury accessory like a Pro Controller over a standard device like the Joy-Con. Therefore, with the price differential and the cost of the rails, we could be looking at savings of maybe $15 by using a Pro Controller in the package instead of a Joy-Con pair as they bundle it up. Add $15 savings on controllers, $15 on batteries, and let's call it $50 for the screen and digitizer, and the cost to Nintendo to produce a machine which is only for a home market console tumbles from potentially $380 to about $300. Add back on Nintendo's markup, let's call it 10% now, because they would want a higher markup to offset the fact that the percentage is now from a lower price. Then add the retailer markup, and let's say it's another 10%, and we get to something in the region of a $375 console before taxes. However, for this, Nintendo would need a second production line which would incur its own costs. Especially in an era of tariff changes, they might need to diversify by having second production lines in all three of the countries they manufacture in: China, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And of course, they already have differentiated production lines for the Switch, Switch OLED, and Switch Lite. Early in the Switch's life, Nintendo found that 20% of people played primarily docked, but that was before the emergence of Switch Lite, but also long before it pushed more heavily into markets where TV mode dominates more, including the USA. It's very difficult to get reliable data on this, and I'm aware that a large chunk of the kind of dedicated Nintendo fans who watch a channel like this one tend to play on the television, but I rather doubt that the docked exclusive crowd is more than a third, and possibly a good deal less than that. Of course, many people might play docked as part of the mix, but the proposition of a true home console means removing that functionality entirely. Let's say then that 25% of people play exclusively dockless, and perhaps a further 10% of people would at least consider using the dock. That gives you maybe a third of the market that could be targeted. However, would a $75 discount be enough to motivate people to bypass this benefit of the system? Even if a full third of people decided to opt for the docked-only model, it would still be capped in terms of its performance. The same could be said for Switch Lite, of course, but the Lite did have significant benefits to Nintendo in terms of allowing second consoles in a home, especially with the release of Animal Crossing New Horizons and its one island per console policy. However, this only anticipates the market as it currently is. What if a dockless Switch were able to penetrate new markets and capture an audience of gamers who would never have considered buying a Nintendo Switch previously? I would suggest that these would fall into one of two categories: PC gamers or people who play other existing home consoles. The problem is that both categories of gamer is that if you're at home, it makes very little sense to play Switch for anything except Nintendo exclusives. For PC gamers especially, who make tiny iterative performance improvements their passion, a Nintendo system is simply not going to scratch that itch, and Nintendo has no interest in catering to this market in this respect. It always seemed to me that it's possible they could decide to distend their console's generation still further by releasing a docked-only Switch 2 a few years ahead of time. After all, the current generational structure of Nintendo Switch systems appears to be that they launch as essentially a home experience that can also be played handheld. Then a handheld model appears 2 or 3 years later and moves the system towards being a true hybrid, and then at the end of its life it appeals mainly to handheld players because those people are largely looking for a lower cost experience, and Switch Lite represents the cheapest model. If Nintendo had launched a Switch 2 as a docked-only console in, let's say, November 2022 with Splatoon 3, Xenoblade 3, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and a slightly earlier version of Mario Kart World as a mix of cross-gen and exclusive titles, it is possible that they could have built a sizable install base first before then bringing in a hybrid model a few years later. But this is tricky. For one thing, you split the market up, and if anything, people would be upset that they would have to opt for a less functional system in order to upgrade, and indeed they may just decide to wait for the hybrid model. You might encourage double dipping in this case, but at a penalty for customer satisfaction. Moreover, it would mean longer where Nintendo is splitting their development output between different consoles, which is far from ideal. And even then, if they released a console in 2022, it still wouldn't be competitive power-wise with the Xbox and PlayStation consoles, and it would limit their ability to launch features like voice chat. All things considered, therefore, I don't really see the audience for a dockless Switch 2 as it stands. However, things can change. The US is perhaps a third of Nintendo's market, with around 40 to 45% of its sales allocated to the Americas more broadly. And in the US, tariffs could make this a possibility in the long term. If a 10% markup is ultimately passed on to consumers, then the base Switch would become a $500 proposition, whereas a docked-only model might be closer to $420, perhaps as little as $400. And if negotiations go sour, at least for Nintendo's interests, and there are higher tariffs charged still, then having a console with a lower wholesale cost could be very advantageous. It may also help Nintendo in territories like Latin America, where, as I've covered in previous videos, the lower wages make games and consoles extremely expensive. But even if a home console was marketable, saleable, and there was no difference in terms of Nintendo's margin, I still think they would prefer people play in handheld mode where possible. Part of their brand is to see people out and about in different places playing Switch, and it represents a subtle piece of word of mouth advertising that people take their Switches on the go and are seen to be playing them. It is harder to get the same impact from something that is hidden away in the corner of the living room. I would put it at just a 10% chance that we will see a Switch 2 docked only model this generation, although if there is a substantial tariff cost on all three of Nintendo's manufacturing bases as a result of negotiations, then that likelihood may go up slightly. For more financial themed content, please do check out this playlist. Big thanks as well to my Patreon supporters and to you for watching, liking, sharing, and hopefully even subscribing. I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.